Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ohio Huntsman Podcast. On this week's show, we've got Mike Tonkovich from the ODNR Division of Wildlife back on. But before we get to Mike, we've got some exciting news. We've been testing a new feed product, and we've been very happy with the results. So we're proud to announce Monster Whitetail Grub as a new sponsor of the Ohio Huntsman Podcast. So Jeff's been testing the product out at his place. So why don't you tell a little bit about the product and what you like about it?
All right. Yeah, I've been testing the product, and I put it out in a location that traditionally has very, very poor late season activity. I put it out in mid-January, and there was not a deer track within hundreds of yards of the location I put it in. There was no deer tracks around in the snow. I could tell where the deer had been because there was snow on the ground.
And we wanted to give it an honest, because you've done some feeding with just regular corn out there, so we wanted to give it an honest test, no bias from the corn that's been there, right?
Right. And the location I put it at was about 100 yards from a cornfield that was picked around Christmas this year.
Okay.
So there was plenty of corn still left on the ground in that field.
Sure.
After a week, I had deer coming in on the regular to this location, spending hours eating the feed.
And actually, you ended up hunting over that feed the last day of season and almost got a deer, right?
Yeah, I had the most success out of that stand I've had ever that day. Saw the most deer that day. They were just coming in left and right. They just happened to all be coming in downwind of me. So as soon as they actually got directly downwind of me, they would smell me and were looking for where I was, and with the leaves off the tree, they could pick me out.
Yeah. So needless to say, we've been super impressed with this product. So if you're looking for a new feed product to try, something to help get your deer through the winter, I urge you to check out Monster Whitetail Grub. Look them up on Facebook. They're Monster Whitetail Grub on both Facebook and Instagram. It's a great product. It's an Ohio company. That's another great thing we like about them. So check them out. Support the sponsor. Support Monster Whitetail Grub, and it helps support the show. And now with that, we're going to get to the call with Mike.
All right. We've got Jeff on the line. This is Jason, and most excitingly, we've got Mike Tonkovich back on the show. Mike is the Deer Program Administrator for the ODNR Division of Wildlife. And I just want to start by saying thanks, Mike, for coming back on the show.
Absolutely. I really enjoy it. I got to say, I was pleasantly surprised by all of the feedback that I received, I should say, from our first show. So hopefully we can keep that going. But it's a great way to spend an hour, that's for sure. Yeah.
So last time we talked, if the listeners out there didn't listen to the previous episode, it was episode number 22. This is, I think, going to end up kind of being a continuation of that episode. So last time we talked, it was just after muzzleloader season. We talked about the harvest numbers, some of the plans for adjusting the harvest by implementing the no-does after gun season on public land. And we covered a lot in that one. So the listeners, you may want to start with that one and then come back to this one, because this is going to kind of be a continuation of that one in a sense. So I think where we're going to start is we had some, like Mike mentioned, we had some good feedback from the last episode, and we got a handful of listener questions that sort of pertained or came out of that episode. So we wanted to run through those first and then kind of get into the final harvest numbers and bag limits and how those things are set. So if you guys are cool with that, we'll jump into that.
Sounds great.
Into it.
All right. So the first one was we talked a little bit last time about moving away from managing by county and going to deer management units. And so one of the questions that came out of that was, would it still be a statewide tag, or would each deer management unit have its own tag and then therefore give you the flexibility, I guess, to charge more or less for a deer management unit that's maybe in more of a trophy zone in the state versus I don't know, for lack of a better term, a lower quality area of the state?
Yeah. So that is that's a really interesting question, and after 24, in a couple of weeks I'll be in year 25 of this. You would think that I would have had just about every question at least once. But Clint McCoy and I, our deer biologist, when I read that email to him, he's like, "Wow, that's interesting. That's an angle that I'd never thought of." So neither of us had really ever considered that. But to speak to a couple things about deer management units, of course, as I hope I made clear the last go around, they're not a done deal yet. That's for sure. We're moving in that direction. I'm hopeful of that. But until we can get all the T's crossed and the I's dotted, we're not signing off on that. But
sure.
That's a great question, and the answer is yes and no. There will be some specificity with regard to permits, guys, but it'll be simply, it won't have anything at all to do with price. It will simply be that you'll have our vision, if you will, is to have make one either sex tag available that would be valid statewide. It didn't matter if you used it in Auglaize County, Adams County, or Ashtabula County. You could use it anywhere in the state, just like you do now. Okay, so that in effect, it would be good for deer of either sex, but it would largely be a buck tag. The follow up, or the sister component to that, if you will, would be the antlerless permits, the $15 antlerless permits, or whatever they're priced at. Those would be, whether we're counties or whether we're deer management units, those permits would be units. We'll call them unit specific, and that could be a county. We could even roll this out under a county situation, under a county management unit like we have now, or deer management unit, if that's what we get to. But those would be unit specific. In other words, you would have to decide that you wanted to buy a permit or put in for a permit for Athens County or Ashtabula County, and that permit would be good only for that county. And the reason being is that the idea is, obviously, we're grouping counties or portions of counties that have similar habitats and in the end should have very similar deer populations. Okay, so we're grouping 2 or 3 counties together, or parts of 2 or 3 counties together, similar deer numbers, similar habitats, and so we would identify, rather than bag limits, guys, we would identify how many antlerless deer we wanted to take out of that group of counties. Okay. And we actually, not to pat ourselves on the back, but the relationship between the antlerless harvest and the impact that it has on the population is we've actually got that pretty well figured out. In other words, if we maybe we talked about this, and I hate to be redundant, but real quick, if 60% of our harvest is antlerless deer, generally speaking, that's going to lead to about a stable population. If a larger proportion of our harvest is antlerless deer, we're probably going to reduce the population, and anything less than 60 will grow the population. The problem has been with a bag limit. It's hard. The model might say, hey, we need to harvest 10% more antlerless deer. Well, the bag limit might give us 2 options. We can either get 4% or 16%. Okay, so but with an allocation of antlerless permits, what would happen there, we would say, hey, we need to harvest 3,000 antlerless deer. We know that the permit success rate is 33%, so we need to issue 9,000 permits for that particular county. So the county would be, whether it's the county or the deer management unit, that would be, in effect, how we would allocate based on the need in that particular unit. So if you bought a permit in Athens, an antlerless permit, you couldn't take it over to Gallia County, for instance, or you couldn't take it back home to Cuyahoga County if that's where you wanted to hunt. You could use your either sex permit anywhere in the state, but we're going to limit you to the county that you apply for. So the permits would be county specific or unit specific. So you're onto something there. We would be controlling permits. There would be no bag limit anymore. Instead of a bag limit, we would control the harvest through the sales process. In other words, everybody would be available. Everybody could put in for one permit, until for the first 2 weeks of the lottery, and then after that, everything would go to over the counter. So it would be a little different feel, but I don't imagine down at the individual hunter level, folks would really see that much difference. The big difference would be, I've got to decide, and it's not a big deal. We know that hunters hunt in multiple counties, but harvesting in multiple counties is a different story. And yes, hunters do kill deer in different counties, but I think everything that we talk about on this show is we're always going to talk about pluses and minuses. There isn't even lowering the cost of a deer permit has some downsides, and that's just the nature of the beast. So when we talk about this antlerless permit allocation system, what will allow us to do is fine-tune the harvest and keep population stable, which has been a big complaint of a lot of folks that, oh my gosh, can we make up our mind already? We're 2 deer this year, 6 deer next year, that kind of thing. So it would bring us to some stability, but I guess what it would do perhaps, guys, is it would force us to do a little bit more planning on the parts of our hunts.
Yeah. And it sounds like maybe it's just another tool to give you finer, more granular control over the population. Is that a good way to look at it?
That's perfect. That's perfect, Jason. So that actually was kind of, when you have limited tools, whether it's working on a house or fixing a car, sometimes you have to be creative, and that's what we did that's kind of the purpose that antlerless permit, making it valid only the first 8 weeks of the season, seemed kind of contrary when you thought about what we were trying to do. But what it did in effect was it essentially doubled the bag limit for the first 8 weeks of the season. So you went from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 3 to 6. Since it wasn't the entire season, it wasn't a 6 deer bag, and it wasn't a 4 deer, and it wasn't a 2. It was a 1.7, or it was a 2.4, it was a 3.1, that type of thing. So it got us. What we were hoping to do is find some middle ground with that regulation. So that was an attempt to be, we had to be really creative and try to find something in between those bag limit choices that we had, because historically, you can look across the state and you'll find a few counties, whether they're all ag or whether they're all forest, where you could probably settle on a bag limit and keep the population stable into perpetuity, I should say. But most counties in Ohio, we have either historically over or under harvested. A 1 deer bag's not enough, so we'll keep it at 1 deer for a few years, and then the herd gets large, and we can talk about how we set bag limits and stuff, and you understand why we then have to go to a 2. We keep it at 2, we bring the population down because we're effectively over harvesting, bring it back down to 1. And the same would apply for a 2 and a 3 deer county as well. So not the best. We've done really well, I think. I think we can pat ourselves on the back with the tools that we've had. But if stability in regulations and stability in populations and predictability is what our hunters would like, then of course we're going to have to try and get to that finer scale in terms of harvest.
Sure. So I guess a follow-up to that before we get into the next listener submitted question was, with you mentioned going to a lottery. Could you dive into that a little bit more? So you said it would be a lottery for, would you say, the first 2?
Yeah, one thing we want to be clear on, guys, is that this is, when you talk about prototypes and they roll out cars at the car shows that won't be in production for 5 years yet, the cars of the future. Well, this is Mike Tonkovich and Clint McCoy brainstorming, and of course, this isn't far-fetched because we're borrowing from other states. But what I would envision is something along the lines of, let's say deer permit sales go on sale June 1st. Okay, so for the first 2 weeks, and this is all hypothetical, but this is we're kind of modeling it after how other states would hold their lottery. First 2 weeks, every resident in the state, they would be open to residents only. Okay, and you would be eligible to buy, you could put in for a permit in the county that you want. The next 2 weeks, we might open it up to non-residents, and then after that, anything that's left over, the permits would be sold on a first-come, first-served basis. So in theory, if you picked a county where we had a need for a large deer harvest and permits were underutilized, you could get, and this is in theory, 12 permits, 12 antlerless permits. But if we were doing our job, we should not have, so imagine this, our first year, we don't know what the demand is going to be. We might have 1,000 or 2,000 leftover unsold permits. Well, then we would, adjust that accordingly. So that's kind of the nature of it. I mean, those are not hard and fast rules. I want to make sure we're clear on that. It would,
sure, yeah.
You'd have to find a way, instead of bag limits, because obviously that's what we're trying to get away from, because bag limits are very, very rigid. We would have to issue, it's a simple matter of a couple phone calls to many of our western states, if you guys have hunted out west, are very familiar with allocations, and understand how those work. Mm-hmm. Even Michigan, Michigan has allocations, but in many of their units, they can't sell enough permits. In other words, they can't kill enough antlerless deer. And I'm sure there'll be counties like that in Ohio. And that's where DMAP and other programs might help direct harvest to those hot spots, if you will. So I don't want to get us too far down that rabbit hole, because number one, those details haven't been worked out, and number two, obviously we have to get final buy-in for a system like that.
Definitely.
So those are great questions.
Right.
Jeff, do you want to do the next question then?
Yeah. So the next question that we have got a lot is, with the new automated game check-in system, first off, why did we decide to go to that? And then also, has there been any research done into, has that affected poaching? Has that increased poaching?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. So the whys, that probably would be better served for our license section, but I can speak to that in some very general terms. I think the biggest reason is that the life expectancy of the system that we had in place, I think we were 7 or 8, maybe more years beyond the expected lifespan of the licensing system that we had before what we called WOCRMS, Wild Ohio Customer Relationship Management System, which is a mouthful, but that was our electronic licensing system. So firstly, the system that we had was on life support, so it needed to be replaced. And I think that's probably the largest reason. Number two, because of the volume of deer that we were killing at that time and checking at that time, it was becoming impractical. In fact, we were actually, I know this may come as a surprise, but we were actually losing check station operators simply because they, believe it or not, felt like the impact of the hunters, and this would go for some of our very large check stations, they were actually costing them business rather than generating them business, because it would just pack up, they would block the pumps, and the list goes on and on. So we actually had some places in East Central Ohio, I recall, having FFA students work those to help some of these bigger check stations out, because it was becoming very burdensome for those operators. The other thing, guys, is it wasn't really that practical. Real quick, without going into a ton of details, think about this for just a second. We were managing, so 2010, I don't have the harvest data in front of me, but I'm sure that we were well over 225, maybe 240,000 deer. Think about the paperwork and the logistics that would go into distributing harvest record forms, paper harvest record forms, metal tags to go with those, and picking those up 2 or 3 or 4 times a season. The amount of work that we saved ourselves by going to electronic game check was immeasurable, and obviously freed up officers to do things much more relevant than serving as delivery gals and guys. Logistics were a big part of it. Cost was a big part of it. Yes, we spent, I think at the time, $16 million for the system, but I believe we got our money's worth. And then, of course, the final thing that comes to mind is, we can talk, I can tell you, and I'm sure we're going to get there, we're going to talk about harvest specifics of this past season that ended a week ago, not even a week ago, right? And imagine doing that in 1998 or 2005 or 2010. We had to wait for all of those data to be key entered, right? We had to have someone manually enter that information. And it took months, actually, to get that information back. And we began in 2003. Up until 2003, we didn't even collect hunter information. All we collected was all we could afford, or chose to, I guess, enter was the county of harvest, the type of deer, the weapon used, that type of thing. Beginning in 2003, we recognized that there was a lot of value in getting the hunter demographic information. How many guys and gals are killing one deer, two deer? When are they killing them? How are they buying permits? All of that stuff was a mystery prior to this electronic licensing system. But at any point in time, I can go online, I can look for a deer, I can summarize the deer harvest, I can see who's bought what, we can talk about where license sales are instantly, and it's all real-time data. So lots and lots of reasons. Now, to get to your the second part of your question, Jeff, I'd like to start out. I'm always trying to think of the best analogy to describe, I guess to address, and we can talk about data. I'll definitely share that with you. But one of the things that I think that comes to mind when I think about the licensing system and the cheating that is often presumed to take place because you can open quote, air quotes around that. Is I was thinking before the show today. A lot of the big box stores have gone to self-serve checkout, and I guess maybe this isn't the best analogy, but I have to ask, just because I could probably take an extra item or two, doesn't mean that I'm going to, because that's not the type of person that I am. You follow what I'm saying? Right. Just because the opportunity presents itself and it's much easier than having someone check your groceries, I could definitely do it if I wanted to. Obviously, I choose not to because that's just the way I am. And I think, in all of the hype, it's, and I understand it's super easy to think that people are cheating, but I don't think a system makes cheaters out of people. I know you guys didn't. I didn't. In fact, the metal tag, there was nothing magical about that. If you could get your deer home, you were home free. I mean, you could drive past the check station, or, in the case of a landowner like myself, if I got it down to the pole barn, I'm scot-free. So I don't think the system made criminals out of people. It absolutely didn't. In fact, if one was going to, if we were going to have that philosophical discussion, I would argue that if anything, it actually increased compliance, because one of the most memorable events in my career was I didn't receive it, they received it at the central office, but I got a copy of it. A guy sent in 5 $20 bills taped to a white sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and said that, he felt like this would probably pay for his fine. He felt that bad about not checking his deer, but he had to get out of the country or something and could not find an open check station in one of his western counties. I forget which one it was, but, so there was I think, couple things. There were a lot of deer that probably were going unchecked because of the inconvenience that bringing a deer, loading your deer up in the back of your Prius, traveling across the county, only to find out that the check station that you hoped was going to be open, they had to close early because there was a water line break or something of that nature. So it presented not only one option for checking deer, but in fact 3 options for checking deer. So I think we need to keep that in mind and maybe use that as context when we talk about the data that we're going to talk about in just a second. So as far as data goes, I guess I think about, what were some of the things that people were thinking would happen in 2011 when we went to electronic game check. Things like more bucks would go unchecked, and bucks would be checked as does, and deer would not be checked, and additional bucks would go unchecked, and all of those things. But when we look at the data, none of that is supported by the data that we have. This is where a picture would be worth 1,000 words. I wish you could see some of this, but I can do my best to describe it. So if we look at, if people were going to not check their deer in 2011, we would expect, and I should say, I guess I should back up, buck harvest is only one of many indices or measures that we use to track changes in population size. We have long-term data sets, for instance, from our bow hunters, which you guys may participate in. The number of deer that you see per hour hunted, or 100 hours on the stand, that type of thing. Most recently we have, we've calculated buck harvest per 100 permit buyers. We've looked at deer. We can calculate deer harvested per 100 days of hunter effort, and we can also look at the number of deer carcasses removed from roadways by ODOT workers. Okay. Along with the buck harvest. Okay, so if something was going to go south, if people were going to all of a sudden not check deer, we would have expected to see a dramatic drop in the buck harvest and or the total harvest in 2011. And it did go down in 2011, but so did the other two indices, the bow hunter observations and the ODOT carcass removal. So my point is, and if you could see these data from 2000, you can go back to 2004 and look at it for the last 14 years. These indices have tracked each other very well. So if people were not checking deer, if people were taking an additional doe or two, it's going to show up in the harvest. That you can't hide that forever. It's going to have an impact, whether at the statewide level, we can look at it at county levels. Eventually, you're going to detect that, and we did not see a shift in the composition in the harvest in 2011. In other words, it didn't all of a sudden go to 60. So in 2010, 62% of the deer we killed that year were antlerless. 2011, it was about 63%. I was able to predict the harvest in 2011 to within a couple thousand deer. So the point is that there is no data to support this notion that people have all of a sudden, quit checking deer or taking multiple deer, because if they were, it would show up in these other indices as well. We would have proof. In other words, one would go one direction and the other indices would be going the other direction. Does that make sense without any pictures?
Yeah, definitely. Jeff, did you have anything else on that, or should we go to the next one?
Well, just kind of heading to that point, in a positive story that I can remember, that now that I know how things happened, that large buck that was poached recently, 26.1, that game warden basically discovered that because he could search those records, because he was looking for a 26-point buck checked in and could find who the hunter was. So I guess that just kind of goes to a positive, kind of shows me a positive there.
Well, listen, guys, think about this for just a second, what this system... Now, obviously, the cheaters are always going to cheat, right? I mean, that's a reality, and there's not a thing that whether it's hunting, whether it's fishing, or whether it's work or school, whatever it is, the cheaters are always going to cheat, and there's a small portion. I believe in my heart of hearts there's a small portion amongst, our 400,000 deer hunters, a very small portion, okay? But think about this. I think that there's this notion that those metal tags were somehow magical and they prevented people from doing things illegally. But back in the day, there was no communication. I mean, very little communication. You might get some communication between officers in adjacent counties. In other words, the Athens and the Benton County officers might compare notes, and they might say, hey, look, Bob Smith, he killed a buck in your county, and he also killed a buck in my county. Okay, that might happen, but officer in Ashtabula County talking to an officer in Adams County, not going to happen. Okay, today, now think, it seems odd that someone who's going to break the laws is also going to check their deer, but I guess that there's a psychologist out there that could probably explain that to all of us. But my point is that your point, Jeff, about being able to utilize this system in a real time situation and address that situation would never have happened back in the day if there wasn't communication between county officers. And I can assure you, imagine laying out 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of paper and trying to figure out if that person also killed a deer in another county. Because remember, once those data were collected, or once those harvest record forms left the wildlife officer's hands and came to our central store where we entered all that information, we didn't enter the hunter information. So it would take a lot of work on the part of officers to identify potential problems. And now, multiple deer checked before they bought the permit, those kinds of things. We can address those things for the few folks out there that don't want to, or may not necessarily know the rules, to give them a break.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the last question we had, and this one, I saved this one for last because it kind of dovetails nicely into the rest of what we wanted to talk about today, was as far as, we've been talking a little bit about bag limits and things like that. How many, just from a data standpoint, how many hunters are utilizing the statewide bag limit or even shooting more than, say, 3 deer per person?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I was really looking forward to, because that's a topic that is really I suppose maybe, I don't know if poorly understood is the word or not, but guys, let me unload some data on you, and you don't really need to see this, but I can sufficiently, I guess I can get the message across by just telling you some things about hunter harvest. In fact, I was telling someone the other day that it doesn't matter if we talk about 2007 or we talk about 1977. The numbers are really not going to be that different. But in 2000, let's start with this. In 2017, and I suspect it'll be very similar to this year, 2017. And I'm going to take the liberty of doing a little bit of rounding. 80% of hunters killed a single deer. Okay. Among successful hunters, 80% took one deer. I guess I can't round, because then that eliminates. Let me back up. If I round it really eliminates the the detail. So 76% of hunters killed a single deer in the 2017 season. 19% killed two deer. 4.2% of successful hunters, now these are successful hunters, not all hunters, but 4.2% of our successful hunters took three deer, and 1% of our successful hunters, so 1 out of 100, took more than three deer. Okay, so to sum that up, now I'll do some rounding. 80% of our hunters will, in any given year, will take a single deer. Now it may go up or down by a couple percent, but by and large, 80% of our successful hunters will take a single deer, and 20% will take two or more. As you know, when we get into the three or mores and the four or mores, we're dropping down to 1% or even less than 1%. But what I think is actually a little bit more intuitive and maybe helpful for our listeners is to think about it not from that standpoint necessarily, because I know percents bother some people, but I like to think about it in terms of the average number of deer taken per successful hunter. Okay, out there, 2017, 2018, whatever year you want to pick. We'll start with 2017. Okay, last year, among successful hunters, the average hunter took 1.3 deer. Okay, 1.3. Make sure we're hearing that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's go back, and the statewide bag limit was 6 deer. Okay, let's go back to 2011. And I'm almost sure that statewide bag limit was 18 at that time. We hadn't dropped it back until about 2013, but I think it was 18 deer. So in 2011, the average among successful hunters, the average hunter took 1.37 deer. Okay, so we went from 1.32 to 1.37 with an 18 deer bag limit. So we tripled the bag limit, and we went from 1.32 to about 1.37. Okay. One other way of looking at this, and I think this is probably one of the most intriguing ways, and we're going to jump back to percentages. But in 2011, I contacted my colleague in Wisconsin, and I asked them to share their hunter harvest data with me. And that year, we had, I'm thinking it was an 18 deer bag limit. Okay, Wisconsin, the same year, 2011. They had what would be, in effect, an unlimited bag limit. Okay, it did not say unlimited, but if you bought you could almost buy a permit per day. You know, the long and short of it is, I wouldn't be lying, wouldn't be stretching the truth if I said they had an unlimited bag limit. Let's compare the proportion of hunters that took 1, 2, 3, and 4 deer in 2011. 18 deer bag versus an unlimited bag. Okay, I'll start with Wisconsin. That year, 72% of hunters in Wisconsin took a single deer with an unlimited bag. Well, let me be very specific. 72.48 in Ohio that year with an 18 deer bag. 72.94. Okay, the number of hunters in Wisconsin that took 2 deer that year, 19.7. Ohio, 19.6. We can go out as far as you'd like, and I'll stop at 3. But the number of hunters in Wisconsin that took 3 deer with an unlimited bag in 2011 was 5.24%, and in Ohio it was 5.3. Okay, so my point is that bag limit, and we can talk at length about it. But bag limit really is not what it's cracked up to be. Now, it does have an effect on the harvest, but it's an indirect effect, guys. It doesn't matter. I think the take-home message is, here in Ohio, six deer bag or a 4 deer bag or even a 3 deer bag really is not going to have a profound impact on the harvest, because as you just heard, we're looking at, even in the years where we had a harvest of 260,000 deer, 250,000 deer, we only moved the needle by 0.2 or 0.3% in terms of the mean number of deer that the average hunter took. Now, what happened in those years is that we increased the number of hunters that were successful through some, I would like to think, through the use of that antlerless permit, and we increased the number of hunters that took 2 deer. But we didn't, you didn't see truckloads of guys or guys going down the highway with truckloads of deer. We may have had a few more guys kill 5 deer, may have had a few more guys kill 6 deer, but by and large, the impact of that antlerless permit, all it really did was bump up the number of hunters killing 0 or killing 1 and killing 2 deer. So bag limit is a very often misunderstood, and people latch on to that, and I can understand why. I mean, I have several quotes and very interesting quotes I like to share with students when I'm lecturing, and one of my favorites is, this gentleman from Perry County said, a 4 deer bag is more than sufficient because at 6, people don't need to kill 6 deer. And the reality is, we could put most of our successful hunters in Perry County that year that killed 6 deer, probably, in a closet. So what I do want to wrap that up with, though, because when we're talking about bag limits, I want to make sure that we're clear that bag limits obviously can have an impact on the harvest, but here's where it really becomes relevant. And probably the only place where it becomes relevant is when you go from a 2 deer bag to a 3 deer bag. That really, and you guys may be able to relate to this, so maybe this will hit close to home for you guys, but when you go down to a 2 deer bag, here's what it does to a hunter. Okay, they can kill 2 deer, 1 buck or 2 antlerless deer. What happens there, everybody's anxious to harvest something, so they go out of the chute anxious to kill something, and they shoot an antlerless deer, and then they realize under a 2 deer bag, wow, I really, even though it's an either sex permit, all I've got left is a buck tag, okay? And I'm really picky on my bucks because I can only kill 1 buck. So what happens is they will hunt the entire season and may never, ever fill that additional tag because they know that they can't shoot a doe unless it's like the last day of the season or the last hour of the hunt, because if they do, they basically have shut themselves out of the opportunity to kill a buck. But if you go to a 3 deer bag, what that does is it allows them, if they shoot that antlerless deer, because they can't help themselves, they're so excited, they shoot that antlerless deer the first day in the stand in October, then they still are either sex hunters. In other words, the season is, they haven't eliminated 2/3 of the deer from the in other words, the pool of available deer isn't reduced by, say, 2/3, because they could if they decided to shoot an antlerless deer. So what happens there is they shoot that antlerless deer early, they continue to hunt, and they get that itch. They get another opportunity that they simply cannot pass up, and they fill that addition. They shoot that next antlerless deer. And now they've extended their season by a month or 2 months by having that additional deer in the bag. And so those are the kinds of things that you really don't get your head wrapped around until you have that electronic license data and those permit sales, understanding how Josh and how Jeff buy their permits and how they fill their permits. Are you buying permits at the same time? Are you buying 1 permit at a time? How does that affect your harvest? And it has a profound effect on how you hunt and how you harvest deer. So a bag limit, I guess my closing remark there is, a bag limit can be a very effective tool, but generally speaking, it's less than 3 that really matters. When you get beyond that, you're not having much of an impact. And part of that's really, guys, one of the, we talked early on, I think in the first show about relationships and about perception and how perception is reality. In my mind, having a 6 deer bag or having an 18 deer bag, all that was doing for us was creating a wall. People were really frustrated with that. They didn't see a deer and they blamed it on the bag. And so they didn't want to have a conversation with us about any other regulation changes until we agreed to lower the bag. And of course, the bag wasn't having an impact on their observations. It was probably something else, but we lowered the bag, and now we have a conversation. We drop that barrier. We eliminate that hurdle that's standing between us and progress. So that's, it's great that someone asked that question, because I want people to understand how relevant, or maybe conversely, how irrelevant bag limit can be.
That's great. I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm like, man, I just love talking to Mike about this stuff, because I mean, the facts are there, the data's there. It's hard to argue with the facts, right? And it just clears up so many questions and like campfire conversations about, that darn ODNR, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm glad, glad we could talk about that, because if there was one set of data that is irrefutable, it is the bag limit. It's the it's the deer killed per successful hunter. But still, as you guys well recognize, at the end of the day, we're still the government, and so the data can't be trusted. So having a conversation, hopefully we can reach a few folks that yes, it really doesn't matter if it's 16 unlimited or 4. It's probably not going to change, because the other thing that we haven't talked about, some of the more practical things. You only have so much time to hunt. There's a finite number of days you're going to hunt. We can add 6 days to the gun season. We can add 4 days to the muzzleloader season. It's not going to generally change the number of days you hunt. You only have limited number of dollars that you can spend on processing, especially if you're having custom meat, custom products made. So you're going to, what opportunity does is simply spread, the harvest pressure out. But at the end of the day, you only have so much freezer space. You only have so much vacation time. And of course, if we have significant others, they only have so much tolerance for us in the tree stand, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Yep. So,
anyway.
Okay. Well, so that, like I said, that kind of leads into, I think I want to transition now to talking about how things finished up in the 2018 season, and kind of go from there. So I think I saw the numbers were in. It looks like the final harvest numbers were just a hair over 172,000 deer this year. Is that correct?
That's correct, Jason. Yep. That's so we can to jump right in there. We can talk about. I think if you do the math, we were down about 8%. Okay, overall over last year, and so we could talk about factors that may have affected that, but I think, if it's okay with you, I think what we should do is, because of the significant changes in regulations on public land this year, I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't break our harvest down into two piles: public land harvest and private land harvest, and have a conversation about each. And the private land's really boring, but we'll talk about it to get it out of the way first. And so we were down 8% total across the board. We killed 184 roughly last year, 186 somewhere in that vicinity. We were down across the board 8%. But we break those into two piles. What we found was that our private land harvest, and I'm going to do my best to make sure I don't mix those two up, but our private land harvest was only down about 5%. Okay, and we can talk about we can look at, guys, there's a multitude of factors that could have contributed to that, and I'm sure that you guys experienced some of those. But license sales were off 5%. Okay, so that in and of itself could have had a profound impact on harvest. We've talked maybe before about hunter selectivity and and aging hunters and how that might be affecting their decisions to harvest or not harvest a deer. But some of the more tangible things that we certainly can talk about. Opening day gun season and even Tuesday were horrible with respect to weather. Our opening day harvest, I think, was down 12%, may have been down a little bit more than that in some parts of the state. But weather was not on our side this year. And even though we posted an increase during our bonus gun season, the only reason why we had an increase, it was no thanks to the weather, because it could have actually been higher, was because last year was horrible. So we had to, and we may have talked about that before, we had to actually increase this year, all else being equal, because last year was miserable. So it had to be really miserable for us to not, exceed last year's harvest. But we had, if you recall, at least here in Southeast Ohio, it rained on Saturday, and I think it, we were in T-shirts on Sunday. So again, and we can talk about some other evidence that weather may have played a really relevant role, because if we look at where we were harvest-wise before we got into gun season, okay, so we look at Sunday before gun season, across the state, our harvest was about where it was last year. We were virtually flat. Okay, so weather didn't have much of an impact. We saw the gun season; it foiled a lot of our hunter trips. And the other thing, we look at postseason. We look at post-gun season or late archery season. It really made up a lot of ground for us this year, in spite of the polar vortex and some frostbite, I suspect. Our archers after gun season really got after the deer, and the reason why they got after the deer, because we can break that down again, thanks to that licensing system, that harvest data, we can break it down by day, by week, after gun season, before gun season, year over, those kinds of things. And what we found was that if we look at the period after gun season this year and compare it to last year's harvest, our archers did really well this year after gun season. So they were picking up some leftovers, if you will, leftover deer, so to speak. But so there's a number of things that could have contributed to that really insignificant 5% deficit that we saw this year on our private land harvest. But let's go over and talk about the more interesting public land harvest. And we're not talking about a lot of deer. So last year on public land, we harvested just over 16,000, like 16.6, I think, across the state on public land. This year, the harvest on public land, and we're talking this from this point forward, I'm going to be talking about public land. This year, we harvested just over 10,000 deer. So what we saw on public land, the total deer harvest on our public lands this year was down 35, I believe 35%, okay? But what's even more intriguing is if we break that harvest, those 10,600 deer, roughly 10,000 deer into two piles, antlered and antlerless, what we saw was a 19% reduction in the antlered buck harvest on our public lands this year, and a 44, and yes, you heard me, 44% reduction in the antlers harvest on our public lands.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
good, bad, or otherwise, I would like to argue, I think there's a couple relevant points. First, let's take a look at that antlered buck harvest, down 19%. Now, just like bag limit can have an impact on hunter behavior, even though the regulation this year was only designed to reduce the antlerless harvest, it could have changed the way that hunters participated, the way that hunters hunted. So it could have. In fact, we've seen this before. We can back up to the mid-1990s, the late 1990s. When we increased the bag on antlerless deer, we would see sometimes an increase in the antlered buck harvest. Even though there shouldn't have been a population increase, the additional effort, guys in the woods spending more time trying to kill that deer, that second antlerless deer, that could have contributed indirectly to a buck harvest increase, even though we didn't add any bucks to the bag. So my point is that the regulation could have contributed some to that 19% reduction, if that makes sense. But what I think the more important, or what the take-home message for me is that our deer populations on public land are down significantly more so than they are on private land. Hence, the need for something to protect antlerless deer and grow populations. And wow, what kind of protection did we see? We saw a 44% reduction in the antlerless harvest on our public lands, which is amazing. I know that we may have talked before about the predicted or the expected impact that it would have, the regulation would have, and that's based on 2 or 3 years worth of harvest data. But what we found in years past is that about 22-23% of the antlerless harvest comes after gun season. So we would have expected to save or reduce the antlerless harvest by 22% by pulling that out. Obviously, and then we added those single antlerless deer. So those two things together, really hard to predict how that synergism might have worked and how we would have ended up with something, whether the sum of the parts would have been greater than the sum of the individual. The effect, you get what I'm saying. Yeah. So the impact, slicing and dicing the impact of those two separate regulations would be very difficult. But at the end of the day, we ended up seeing a 44% reduction in the antlerless harvest. And one other piece of information to wrap up that is that Clint McCoy and our pilot were able to fly 6 or 7 of the wildlife areas that we have that we have in that camera study. I think I may have mentioned that we have 16 of our wildlife areas involved in a camera study, and so those were all done, of course, before season. But we picked a handful of them to do a post-season survey. And in conjunction with that, we also were able to take advantage of some snow and put the helicopter in the air and count deer on 6 of our wildlife areas. And the numbers of deer that we saw were very, very encouraging. Now, of course, that begs the question, is that a result of the regulation savings, or is that, as some would like to argue, proof that you didn't need the regulation? And I'm leaning towards the former, that in fact, what we're experiencing there, what we're seeing there is the savings that we may have generated as a result of limiting hunters to antlered bucks only after the gun season. So pretty exciting times right now. Of course, what's that mean for the future? What I'm hoping it will mean is that we keep that regulation locked in place for at least 2 more years, and then make a decision about the impact that it had on. And most importantly, guys, one of the things that folks need to understand, this is vitally important, is that we can count deer all day long. We can show you that we counted more deer. We can show you on the cameras that we counted more deer. But what we really are looking for is that in year 4, or even in year 2 and year 3, our public land hunters tell us in their surveys that, hey, I saw more deer. I saw more antlered buck sign. My overall hunting experience has gone through the roof. That's really the metric that we're looking for. So we'll keep track of that. We're going to keep a watchful eye on that, and then make a decision after those data come in. But in order to get those data, and this is me on my soapbox, guys, we need hunters to return their surveys.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from a selfish standpoint, I'm excited by that information because, you know, I think we talked last time, we have a hunting camp down in Washington County, and, you know, there's a hunting journal or a log down there, you know, where guys write, saw X number of deer today, you know, and you read back in years past and, you know, just the number of deer they saw, and it's just fun seeing deer. And so the opportunity to hopefully see more deer in the coming years down there in the Wayne National Forest area is encouraging for me from a sort of selfish standpoint.
Understood. Now, I wish we had surveyed those areas last year at the same time so that we could document whether or not that's more or less or the same, because it may be nothing. You know, there may be nothing to it. It may have nothing to do with the regulation. The only way we're going to know is moving forward. If we counted 10 deer this year, hopefully we'll count 15 next.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Jeff, do you have any follow-up questions or anything you want to ask Mike?
No. I think we covered a lot of ground today. You know.
Yeah, because believe it or not,
a lot of good information.
Yeah, because believe it or not, we're already on an hour here, so I want to respect Mike's time. And Mike, do you have any kind of closing or concluding thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, well, you know what, guys, I'm thankful for you taking the time to do this. Again, I know that everybody is busy. I am obviously I'm getting paid to do this. I love it. I guess I would offer that I could do it for free sometimes, and my wife thinks that I do it for free. I've got to take my timesheet home to convince her that I didn't. But I appreciate you guys sitting down and taking your time out of your busy schedule, because I know while everybody may not like what they're hearing, I think a lot of people are listening, and you know, that's the key. I mean, I think relationships and lending an ear to our hunters and providing some feedback is so critically important to the success of this program and why it's been so successful. So I say thank you to you guys for your time, and I hate to do another public service announcement, guys, but you know, we'll send out 10,000 surveys in October via email to hunters, and we're doing well to get 1,000 back. And it's difficult. We can make statewide decisions based on those numbers, but we can't drill down into counties or deer management units without additional help. So I know you're out there. I know you're listening. Some of you, I know you're busy, but please take a little bit of time and get that survey back to us. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, definitely. Definitely get your surveys back in. Those are shockingly low numbers.
Yeah, it used to be about 23%, 24% back in the heyday, but we were mailing 2 and 3 postcards, and you know, lots of money involved in that. Yeah. So we're sending 10,000 email invites out, and I know I I think with a high degree of confidence, 95% of those are being delivered. So I understand that everyone is busy. You know, people want to know about our toothpaste selection, where we like to eat, what shows we like to watch, and it gets old. But if you have an interest in deer management and you want to be part of those part of the decision-making process, we do value your input, and we rely very heavily on those surveys.
So I guess along those lines, other than the surveys, what is the best way for people, you know, hunters in Ohio, to get their questions answered, to reach out to you, to reach out to anybody at the Division of Wildlife or ODNR, and if they have a question or they need something clarified, what is the best way for people to reach out?
Well, I'd say we have, you know, social media is very important, obviously today, and our agency is also has a big presence in that. So Facebook is a way to reach the Division of Wildlife. You can to talk specifically, say for instance about the upcoming proposals. Once those are developed, you'll have an opportunity to visit us at the open houses if you'd like to meet us. If you can't make that, which we understand because you know they're only one of you've got 5 choices across the state. We'll take comments online. So you visit our website. That's going to be, you know, open houses are always the first Saturday in March. So we'll take comments probably through the close of business that day, maybe on Sunday. And I think we'll make those, the regulations, of course, will be heard by council next week. So I'm sure shortly after that, the proposals will be up. But if you just want to, you know, if you want to reach the Division of Wildlife, our 1-800, oh my gosh, wildlife, I guess is that's horrible. I should know that. wildohio.com. I just say call me if you got a question. We get plenty of emails, and phone calls. We're here to answer your questions. Don't be bashful. We may have a summit, hold a summit or two, deer summit or two this summer. I think we're looking at July. So, maybe, listeners can get an opportunity to join us at one of those two in Central Ohio and again, I think we'll do it again in Northeast Ohio as well, because there seems to be a lot of interest in that neck of the woods. So Facebook, calls, emails, website, we're really not that hard to find.
Lots of ways to reach out.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, with that, again, thank you, Mike, for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yep.
And, we'll have to do another one here soon.
Yeah, I think I will wear you out before you wear me out.
All right. Well.
All right, guys. You have a great evening.
Challenge accepted. All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
And there you have it. I want to thank Mike again for coming on the show. We really appreciate him taking the time to come on and talk about all these things. Let us know what you want us to ask him. We're going to try to keep doing these with Mike. I think they're really good. They're educational and informative. So let us know what questions you have for Mike or anybody at the ODNR Division of Wildlife, and we will do our best to get them answered. As always, subscribe to the show. That's the best way to get notified about new episodes. Subscribe to our newsletter. There'll be links to all of this in the show notes. And follow us on social. We're Ohio Huntsman on Facebook and Ohio Huntsman Podcast on Instagram. And as always, thanks for listening.